And I think all of us can agree that sodium is probably among the most studied of nutrients of all of the panoply. And it also remains one of the most controversial with respect to implementing the recommendations, particularly about reducing levels of sodium in the food supply. There is a huge body of literature. I don't know how else to describe it. Mountainous body of literature about the relationships between sodium and various health outcomes, particularly focused on hypertension and cardiovascular disease. And within the department right now, with our partners at the Department of Health and Human Services, the staff are preparing the next edition of the dietary guidelines, expected to be issued before the end of the calendar year, so in the month of December. We've also, through the Food and Nutrition Service, been working closely with the Congress on the reauthorization of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, and levels of sodium in school meals has emerged as being an important and also controversial issue within the reauthorization. So it's not just a scientific debate, it's also become a political debate. Our role at the department, many of you are familiar with, it goes in many different directions. The portfolio that I have for research, education, and economics very much focuses on providing the scientific evidence base for program and policy decisions that are made by USDA agencies, but also by regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration and EPA that are outside of the department, and also the Food Safety and Inspection Service, responsible for meat and poultry and located within the department. As Casey has outlined in her presentation, FDA has been working on a concept of a phased approach towards reducing sodium in the food supply, and our agencies in my mission area have a number of different roles to play in working collaboratively, not only with the regulatory agencies with interest in this topic, FSIS and FDA, but also with the industry. So from the perspective of ARS, the Agricultural Research Service, the intramural agency, part of their responsibility is in the human nutrition realm, with research that they continue on the levels of sodium in the food supply, as well as through the dietary surveys that are done on an annual basis. ARS also, in its intramural laboratories, conducts some research on safety of processed meats, and often works collaboratively with companies in those types of studies. National Institute of Food and Agriculture provides grant support to university-based researchers in the food safety area, and also through the formula funds, or what are now called capacity funds, that flow to the state agricultural experiment stations, also provide some research support and infrastructure support for food safety research at the land-grant universities. And the Economic Research Service periodically does studies of, well, what is the impact of regulatory action in different sectors of the agricultural economy. So an issue like this would be one that ERS at some date in the future may be looking at what the economic impact has been of efforts to reduce sodium in the food sector. They've done similar things for example, the trans fat labeling rule, and those are also important contributions to our understanding of the effects of different regulatory approaches. There's also a new entity that's been created that may have a role to play if the directions that are taken to reducing sodium in the food supply, as Casey Heinz outlined in her presentation, is to form public-private partnerships. And that is through the newly established Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and also for the existing foundation with the Food and Drug Administration. So there are new opportunities where there are public-private partnerships for facilitating those through these foundations that have been established. The most recent scientific review of the relationship between sodium and health was conducted by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, already referenced. They used an evidence-based approach, as previous committees have in recent editions of the Dietary Guidelines. And they identified sodium as a nutrient of public health concern because of a number of different reasons. One of them is the dose-dependent relationship between sodium intake and blood pressure. Blood pressure, in this case, acting as a surrogate for cardiovascular disease risk. And this committee, in their evidence-based review, graded the evidence on this relationship for adults as strong and for children from birth to 18 years as moderate. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee also noted that despite recommendations being made by Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committees since 1980, and in every edition since 1980, that intakes in the American population still exceed the recommendations. The current average sodium intake in the U.S. is almost 3,500 milligrams per day, well above the IOM's dietary reference intake tolerable upper level of 2,300 milligrams per day for most people. And the relationship between sodium intake and cardiovascular disease outcomes was the third reason that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee renewed the recommendation to reduce levels of sodium in the food supply. The Advisory Committee reviewed new evidence related to sodium both for children and adults and recommended that for the general population that sodium intake should not exceed 2,300 milligrams per day, although intakes below this level is recommended for individuals who have prehypertension or hypertension. And we need to note as well that 2,300 milligrams per day is and remains the current DRI. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee also concurred with the Institute of Medicine study that Chris Taylor, in her opening comments, brought to our attention, finding that the evidence is inconclusive as to whether lowering sodium intake below 2,300 milligrams per day has any effect on CVD outcomes or mortality. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommendation was that we need in the United States a coordinated and comprehensive strategy, including partnerships with the food industry to reduce the sodium content of foods in the food supply. Sodium, as has already been noted, is ubiquitous in the food supply. It makes it very difficult for individuals to achieve the recommended intakes. So the 2015 Advisory Committee recommended that federal, state, and local agencies consider a coordinated and comprehensive strategy that includes partnerships with the food industry to reduce the sodium content of foods in the food supply. So reducing sodium essentially focuses on reducing salt, sodium chloride, widely used to enhance flavor and palatability, and also, as already noted, serving a lot of other functional requirements within foods. So the general message from the Advisory Committee in its report was to stay the course on sodium. And as I noted, we're awaiting the report that will be the dietary guidelines for Americans. It's going through its final clearance within the departments, and our expectation is that that report will be issued before the end of the year. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about uses of salt in food and by the food industry. And as Dr. Doyle indicated, there are a lot of uses for sodium-containing products in the food supply. But salt, sodium chloride in particular, plays some vital roles. I'm focusing on meat because of the regulatory responsibilities that USDA has. But salt helps to bind meat proteins together. It's also a binding agent between meat components and fat. It also increases the water binding capacity during cooking, and the final product as a result has an improved texture, tenderness, as well as a better taste, increased palatability. The concern about reducing sodium levels and attendant food safety problems, I think, is a legitimate concern. Salt plays a key role in preservation, and therefore both pathogens as well as spoilage organisms are affected by salt levels, and again, particularly in meat products from the USDA perspective. The safety of meat products may be compromised by growth or survival of pathogenic and the growth of these pathogenic organisms in meats can cause illness if ingested. The antimicrobial activity of salt relates largely to its ability to lower water activity being the measure of the amount of water that's available for microbial growth as well as for other chemical reactions in food. And microorganisms require an adequate amount of water in order to survive in the matrix they're in and to grow. Adding salt to food results in the loss of water from the microbial cell, causing the cells to undergo an osmotic shock, which causes cell death or growth retardation. And other impacts of salt on microbial growth and survival include the direct toxicity of chloride ions from the salt, removal of oxygen from the medium, sensitization of the microorganisms to carbon dioxide, as well as reduced activity of proteolytic enzymes. Also, as already noted, there are a lot of different strategies to reducing sodium in meat products that also involve combinations with other chemicals in order to preserve the meat and to maintain all of the functionality as well as palatability. Salt exhibits a selective action against certain microbes and does not inhibit the growth of all microbes. In food processing formulations, the amount of salt used is not sufficient by itself to adequately preserve foods. Salt does contribute in combination with a range of other strategies, techniques, and factors, as shown on this table, to the production of a safe product. So when salt levels are reduced, it may be necessary to add or modify the overall array of critical factors to ensure that there are adequate safety margins and also to protect the quality of the product. A literature review that was conducted by our colleagues at the Food and Drug Administration identified studies of successful sodium reduction in a number of meat and poultry products, including cooked and cured hams, sausages, frankfurters, and deli meats. And these studies identify potential sodium concentrations lower than currently commonly used levels that may be compatible with microbiological stability. However, many of the studies available in the peer-reviewed literature are on a very small scale, pilot plant kind of level of production, or even at the laboratory scale. So there is additional work that can only be done in conjunction with the food companies to assess the scaled up processes. So in conclusion, The science supports the call for a reduction of the average dietary sodium intake to 2,300 milligrams per day, but it's inconclusive about significant reductions beyond that level. And the science confirms the value of sodium in protecting the public from microorganisms in meat, poultry, and processed foods. It also suggests that there are alternative processes available that can safeguard the public while also reducing sodium levels in both of these areas. So we do need a coordinated and comprehensive strategy, including partnerships with the food industry, to reduce the sodium content of foods. And from my perspective, the pathway forward is going to be very dependent on public-private partnerships. And I say that plural because there are many different categories of foods. And as Casey Heinz pointed out in her presentation, and also Dr. Doyle in his introductory comments, there's not one single approach that's going to be applicable across all of the very diverse categories of sodium-containing foods. So it's particularly appropriate that ILSI has convened this meeting, really focusing on what are the technical steps forward that are feasible to undertake, and how do we begin to form the kind of partnerships that are going to help us and help the food industry to implement this approach. So it's particularly appropriate that ILSI convene this meeting with its representation from the private sector, from academia, and from government. And I think it's also particularly appropriate that ILSI stepped up to this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommendation to really start developing this comprehensive approach. Because of sodium's functional roles in food, safety is a legitimate concern in products where sodium acts as a preservative. And as we go forward through the day, I really regret that I can't be here the whole day. We just got a notice this morning as I was coming into the meeting that the government alert level has been moved up a level, so in anticipation of the Pope and Xi Jinping, the president of China, being in town. So I'm going to have to go back to the office immediately after this. But I did want to end by saying, I also think that with this new Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research that was established under authorization from the 2014 Farm Bill, that there are some really good opportunities for new approaches to public-private partnerships, and particularly in this area of sodium reduction. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, this foundation has a charter that's similar to the NIH Foundation, with one addition, and that is that it also has received a $200 million transfer of funds from the Commodity Credit Corporation, an arm of USDA, to the foundation, to serve as a match for funds that will be coming from the private partners outside the federal government. Just a week ago, on September 14th, Dr. Sally Rocky has joined the foundation as its first executive director, coming from the extramural program directorship at the National Institutes of Health. So she's well familiar with competitive grants processes, well familiar with public-private partnerships, and also had a long history at USDA before she went to the National Institutes of Health. She directed the National Research Initiative at the predecessor agency to NIFA, so the Competitive Grants Program for USDA. But the foundation is now open for business. They're looking for unique public-private partnerships. They will be able to match the funds that come from the private sector And I can't think of a better topic than this one as the means of, starting out some of the work of the foundation, and also for serving a very important public health endpoint, and that's to successfully help us to reduce sodium levels in the food supply. It's going to take unique approaches, it's going to take new ideas, and I am just thrilled that there's such a good attendance at this meeting today, and look forward to new ideas about how to approach, from the technical perspective, the reduction of sodium in the food supply. I also can answer some questions if we've got some time, Chris.
Good morning again. Allison Kretzer from ILSI North America. Question, and I don't know whether you're able to kind of comment on this. As you mentioned the school lunch program and the breakfast program, whether or not you are beginning within the agency to learn a little bit about some of the learnings as they did kind of the phase 1 sodium reduction levels. I believe they're beginning to move into phase 2, and some of what they learned or what happened and so forth very much would be helpful.
Well, Allison, I wish I could, but I'm not briefed up on that particular project. We could get FNS to help provide a response, but that's one project that's outside of my portfolio that I'm not fully aware of.
Thank you.
I know we need to talk about some of the issues. One of the questions that came up was a lower shelf life. Would consumers be willing to accept lower shelf life? Do you care to opine on that at all?
Well, this is also a good example of where we have competing priorities. As you all heard a week ago, the Secretary issued, along with the EPA Administrator, a challenge to reduce food waste in the United States by 50% by the year 2030. And the question of shelf life then becomes a very important one, as well as educating consumers about what those different dates on foods mean with respect to their safety. So I think there are these trade-offs that, from a policy perspective, you have to start making and trying to figure out if reducing sodium levels reduces shelf life. How do we communicate with consumers about how to make the best use of the food that they consume and to reduce the wastage that's associated with it? So it takes you into consumer education and messaging in a way that also has to be a very coordinated approach.
Good morning, Dr. Woteki. First of all, terrific presentation. I really appreciate all that microbiology. You're becoming a card-carrying microbiologist. But recently I've been in Europe, and European colleagues raised the question, in the U.S., sodium reduction has become so important. What is the government doing to fund research in this area? Is it just a company's responsibility? And I can see both sides of that equation, but the reality of it is, this is not a simple solution. And it's multidisciplinary. It's going to take sensory analysis. It's going to take microbiologists. It's going to take meat scientists and dairy scientists and so on. And I like your idea about the private-public partnerships, but can there be other opportunities within USDA to fund individual or groups of researchers to address this issue?
The answer to that is clearly yes. And there are, I think, two ways that could be done. One is, I see Dr. Isabel Walls in the audience from NIFA, so the food safety program and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the competitive grants that they provide in the AFRI program, Agriculture, Food and Research Initiative, that is one potential candidate. The regular structuring of those programs, interaction between FDA and NIFA and FSIS and setting the priorities within the program, that is one mechanism that could get some funds within that area identified and awarded competitively. The second approach is there's a new provision, again, in the 2014 Farm Bill that NIFA is implementing right now. And the provision allows commodity organizations to petition NIFA to establish a priority within AFRI of interest to the commodity organization. And NIFA, if it agrees to this priority, the commodity organization will fund half of the cost of the program. NIFA will fund the other half. So it's a way also of another public-private partnership approach within the competitive grants program. So it might be that one or more of the commodity organizations might be interested in funding research on lower levels of sodium within that commodity and be able to partner with NIFA and provide for a new program that way within AFRI.
Terrific, thank you.
Another question?
Good morning. Good morning.
I think I just broke the microphone. Along the line that Mike was asking, I know for a long time, industry and also a lot of academics have struggled trying to find funds for basic research, especially in salt taste mechanism. And the number one problem we have with any sodium reduction is taste. I mean,
Yes.
if you don't have the taste in the product, you can forget about food safety studies. So will this new research foundation that you just mentioned be willing to fund basic research? Because I know, the questions and a lot of work has been done by a lot of companies and also Monell has done a lot of work on that the questions are very basic research questions. Will there be room for this kind of research within the new foundation?
And they have not yet awarded their first grant. So anything that I say is speculative about what the foundation may or may not do. But Jorsan, across the whole spectrum of research, is wide open for this foundation to fund. There are represented in the board members a number of scientists with very fundamental research backgrounds who are very much interested in seeing the foundation fund some very basic research on some important problems in agriculture and food. Having said that, dilemma that the foundation has is that they have to have a match from outside the federal government. And that means that whoever that partner is, another foundation, a food company, a consortium of companies, another foundation like the ILSI Foundation, has to be willing to fund very fundamental research. So I think that this foundation is going to be very open and very supportive and advocate for more funding for fundamental research in food and agriculture. They would like to be able to play a role, but the catch for them is going to be they need a non-federal partner who will fund half of the project.
I know sodium reduction is an important public health strategy, but having worked on this for a long time, and now that I'm retired, I can ask all these difficult questions. So it doesn't reflect, any sort of affiliation I have with where I am right now. But I always wondered whether the cost of changing the food supply using sodium reduction as an intervention for health issues that we have. Will the cost, the question is, will that benefit be realized in terms of the health benefits? And have that calculation been done?
I think that's actually a question to ask our colleagues from the Food and Drug Administration. They are really in the driver's seat with respect to this strategy of incremental reductions, and the cost benefit of it.
There has been a look at some of those things, and I think that CDC could speak to this too. In fact, I noted a paper that they partnered on in a presentation by Cox and all, which was a look at the health benefits or reduction in deaths. In terms of, does that answer your question? Or there are a number of types, there are a number of analyses out there that look at the benefits in that way. In terms of an approach that we would take, as I mentioned, we kind of have modeled an experiment, taken steps to better understand where we can go with things. And we do feel that could be a great public health benefit, actually. So it's just the process moving forward and better understanding what's feasible and what can actually really go with it. So, does that answer what you're saying?
So I at least, Chersen, I was taking your question from a purely regulatory perspective. Has a cost-benefit analysis been done? And
Does CDC want to also make a comment, Barbara or Kath? Because this is an issue, cost-benefit analysis.
Christine Otler, CDC, and there have been several modeling studies done on the cost and benefit of reducing sodium. And I think research shows that even small reductions in sodium by just about 400 milligrams per day can show a significant reduction in blood pressure, potentially could save. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there is a statistic for the number of lives and the number of dollars that can be saved. So I will get that and make sure to send it to you so that we can put that around. Right.
Chosen, can you get to the microphone?
From a consumer perspective, and that's where the struggle is that if the consumer had to spend extra $10 or $20 a week just to try to follow the DASH diet, and the payback for her might be maybe, if you, depending on the kind of subjects you are, might be 5 ml of systolic reduction, or maybe 2 ml of diastolic. Will that be sufficient for her in terms of improvement in her health status? I mean, those are the struggles that we go through between population data and also in individual settings. And that's where I think the food industry is struggling from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, I think the hope is that sodium would be reduced across the food supply, and that there wouldn't necessarily be an increase in cost that's passed on to consumers, so they wouldn't necessarily be paying more. But research has shown that on average, blood pressure does change within just a couple weeks of reducing sodium. So there is the potential for them to see some benefit because of the sodium reduction.